The single black dad's daughter was mocked for having no mom, until a woman took his hand. The sun hadn't fully risen when DeShawn Williams heard the first sound of his daughter's anxiety. It wasn't a cry, it wasn't even a direct complaint. It was the silence. That particular silence that comes when an 8-year-old is awake but hasn't yet gathered the courage to face the day. He'd learned over 7 years of raising Amara alone that this silence meant she was afraid of something. This silence required his presence before she had the words. DeShawn stepped out of his own room and found her sitting on the edge of her bed in her nightgown. She was staring at the yellow dress hanging on her closet door. The dress was new, not new in the way children understood new in the way a single father understood it, saved for, purchased on sale, kept pristine for moments that mattered. Family day. He sat beside her, not asking questions yet, just being present in the space of her fear. Amara leaned against him without speaking. Her small body was tense in a way that hurt him to witness. He'd come to understand, through years of parenting alone, that the greatest pain wasn't the exhaustion. It wasn't working night shifts on the city's electrical grid while another parent's schedule allowed them to be home. It wasn't the financial calculations that happened in the kitchen late at night. No. The greatest pain was knowing that his daughter carried a wound he couldn't fix by working harder, or staying up later, or trying harder. The wound of being incomplete in a world that measured families by their shape. "I don't want to go," Amara whispered. DeShawn didn't push. He just braided her hair, slowly, carefully, the way he'd learned from late-night YouTube videos when she was 3 years old and crying because he didn't know how. He'd sat up at 2 in the morning watching the same 3-minute tutorial over and over until his hands understood the rhythm. By now, it was muscle memory. By now, it was a language they shared without speaking. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon toast when they made it downstairs. He'd bought cinnamon rolls the night before after his shift, then spent 10 minutes arranging them in a different pan to make them look homemade. He'd learned that family events came with unspoken standards. Nobody wrote them down, but everyone somehow knew. Other parents would bring casseroles, fresh fruit platters, scrapbooks with professional photos and careful captions. DeShawn was bringing cinnamon rolls that weren't his own. And a lunchbox he'd packed at 4 in the morning before work. He was bringing effort. And for now, that would have to be enough. "You don't have to go if you don't want to," he told Amara as she sat at the table, coloring the edges of a place card that read "My Family" in purple letters. The card was her teacher's assignment, a chance for each child to express who their family was, what it meant, how it felt. Amara didn't look up from the card. "I want to go," she said. But her voice carried the weight of someone choosing courage over comfort. He knew that tone. He'd learned to distinguish between her different kinds of bravery. This was the kind that came from fear. From a determination to prove something to herself, even when her body was telling her not to. "Then we go," he said simply. The Toyota pulled into the Riverside Elementary parking lot at 8:52 a.m. The October morning was cool, the kind of air that made everything feel new and vulnerable at the same time. Other families were arriving in newer cars. Some of them still had their engines running while parents unloaded carefully constructed display boards, typed out family histories. Children in pressed clothes moved with the confidence of those who'd never wondered if their family shape was wrong. DeShawn turned to Amara before they got out. She was staring out the window at the other families. Her hands were folded in her lap. "You stay close if you need to," he said. "And if you want to leave, we leave. No questions asked." She nodded, but she didn't move. He came around to her side and opened the door himself. A small gesture, but something he did every time they went somewhere together. These small rituals mattered. These small rituals said something. "You are worth the extra step. You are worth my full attention." The multi-purpose room had been transformed since yesterday, when he'd volunteered for setup. Paper hearts hung from the ceiling. Streamers in primary colors twisted along the walls. A banner read, "Celebrating the people who love us." But the real message was on the bulletin board along the far wall. Family photos covered nearly every inch of space. Smiling mothers and fathers holding babies, grandparents at graduations, siblings in matching Christmas pajamas. 100 versions of the right family, arranged carefully in place. A visual testimony to what completeness looked like in this building. Amara's photograph was near the bottom corner. Just one. Last summer at the county fair. Amara in front holding a giant stuffed bear. DeShawn behind her with one hand on her shoulder. They were both squinting into sun they hadn't wanted to face. The photo was real. Not posed, not perfect, not carefully constructed for public consumption. It showed two people who were trying. It was also the only photograph they had together, because DeShawn was always the one behind the camera. Mrs. Patterson hurried over with careful energy. The energy of someone who meant well but had never experienced the particular kind of erasure. The erasure that comes from being the child of a single black father. In a school that didn't know how to count that as a complete family. "Riley, you look beautiful," Mrs. Patterson said, using the wrong name. A name Amara had never had. A name that existed only in Mrs. Patterson's mind. A kind of filler. The placeholder name for the child without a mother. Amara corrected her softly. "I'm Amara." Mrs. Patterson blinked, adjusted, continued as if the moment hadn't exposed something about her own carelessness. "Of course, yes. And Mr. Williams, thank you so much for coming." "Wouldn't miss it," DeShawn said, and he meant it, with an intensity that surprised even himself. He would come to everything, no matter how much it cost him. In shifts missed, in sleep lost, in the quiet knowledge that other men were home in the evenings while he worked. The introductions began. Children stood one by one, holding cards or poems or drawings, talking about their families. "I have 2 mums and they both love me. My dad says I have his eyes. My family makes dumplings together every Sunday and my grandma teaches me her secret recipe." The narratives were various and genuine, each child offering their own version of belonging. Then Mrs. Patterson called Amara's name. She walked to the front of the room holding her place card. Her shoulders were pulled tight. DeShawn could see the exact moment she decided to be brave. A small straightening of her spine, a slight lift of her chin. "My family is..." Amara's voice was soft, barely carrying to the back of the room. "My dad. He braids my hair and he makes sure I have everything I need. And he's the only one, but he's enough." The last 4 words hung in the air, like a question being asked and answered simultaneously. There was a moment of silence. A silence that was different, not the silence of contemplation, but the silence of sudden discomfort. A few nervous laughs from children. A few who didn't quite understand what was wrong, only that something had shifted. Several adults looked away, as if the question itself was impolite, as if the answer was a failure they'd all agreed not to examine too closely. And then a boy in the back, Devon, asked the question that would reshape the entire morning. "Where's your mom?" The room went quiet, in a different way. Not the quiet of contemplation, but the quiet of sudden exposure. A few nervous laughs from children who didn't quite understand, who only knew something was wrong. Several adults looked away. Amara's face crumpled. Not dramatically, not with tears immediately falling, but the internal collapse was visible. The moment a child's carefully constructed confidence just gave way. The moment her body understood what her mind had been trying to protect itself from. There was something wrong with her family, or at least something was missing from it, something that mattered enough that other people noticed its absence. DeShawn moved toward her instantly. Every cell in his body was signaling, "Get her out of here, take her home. Protect her from the shame in this room before it solidifies into something she carries forever." He reached for her hand, already turning toward the door, already planning how he would explain to her teacher that this event was not designed for children whose families didn't come in pairs. But just as they turned toward the exit, the back door opened. A woman stepped inside. The room recalibrated. She was the kind of woman who made you understand immediately that she belonged in places. A tailored charcoal blazer, probably more than DeShawn made in 2 weeks. A silk scarf in deep jewel tones. Understated jewelry that meant something. Gold that caught the light in a way that suggested quality and intention. Her dark skin carried the particular confidence of someone used to being looked at, not needing permission for her presence. She moved through the room without hesitation. Didn't stop to check in with Mrs. Patterson. Didn't introduce herself, didn't ask where she should be. She moved with the clarity of someone who knew exactly where she was supposed to be. Who would have moved there regardless of anyone's approval? She walked directly to DeShawn and Amara. Then she took DeShawn's hand. Not a handshake, not a greeting with appropriate distance. She simply held his hand, her fingers threading through his, in a way that suggested muscle memory, that suggested her body had been waiting for permission to touch his again. "I'm sorry I'm late," she said, and her voice was soft but absolute. She said it only to him, as if the rest of the room had fallen away, as if there was only the 2 of them, existing in a moment that had no witnesses. "I'm Victoria." The room went absolutely still. Amara looked up at the woman, then at her father, then back at the woman. Her small face was working through a mathematical problem that had no solution. "Who is this? How does she know my dad? Why is she looking at both of us like we matter?" Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted from confusion to something like judgment. Several parents had their phones out, not obviously, but the angle of their arms suggested they were recording, capturing the moment. The woman in the expensive coat stepping out of nowhere, claiming a space beside a working-class black man and his daughter. Victoria knelt beside Amara, making herself eye level with her, reducing the distance between them with a kind of intention that felt dangerous and necessary all at once. "Hi, sweetheart," Victoria said. "I'm Victoria. You must be the Amara I've heard so much about." Amara stared at her, didn't answer, but she'd stopped crying. There was something in Victoria's presence, something that communicated. Whatever just happened, whatever this woman represents, it was chosen, it was intentional. This wasn't pity, this was power. DeShawn was frozen. He knew her. Not from yesterday, from 12 years ago. From a time in his life when he'd been different, when he'd had possibilities that didn't include working night shifts, when he'd had possibilities that didn't include calculating meal expenses. She'd been there in that version of his life, before everything changed. Before raising a daughter alone had become the singular focus of every decision he made. The room had witnessed something undeniable, A woman of evident status. A woman whose presence communicated wealth, education, authority, had walked into a school event and chosen to stand beside a black working-class man and his daughter. She'd claimed them publicly. She'd made it impossible for anyone in the room to look away or pretend they hadn't seen. The question had changed. It was no longer, "Where's your mom?" It had become, "Who is she? How does she know them? And why does she look at them like they're worth her time?" Victoria Sutherland had been awake since 5:47 a.m., earlier than she needed to be, earlier than was reasonable, given that she hadn't slept well, given that the past week had been a series of phone calls and text messages that she'd been ignoring. She'd sat in her car in the parking lot of June's Cafe, a place she'd worked for 7 years before her life had changed, holding a cup of cold coffee, trying to figure out what she was about to do, and whether it was brave or delusional. The decision had been made 4 days ago, in the exact moment when DeShawn walked into the cafe at 7 in the morning, wearing a work jacket covered in electrical dust. He'd ordered coffee black, no sugar, like he always had, 12 years ago, before they were different people living different lives. She'd recognized him instantly, in the way you recognize someone who once mattered to you, in the muscle memory of it, in the way her body reacted before her mind had caught up. He'd looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from night shifts, from keeping a household running on one's salary, from the kind of work that kept other people's lights on. While you drove home in the dark, he'd checked his phone at one point, a photo that made his tired face soften. A little girl, she'd assumed, dark eyes like his, small in the way that suggested she was still young enough to believe her father was the strongest person in the world. He'd left without knowing she was there. But that afternoon, she'd heard about Family Day. Not from him, from June, the cafe's owner, mentioning it to a regular customer. "That handsome man who comes in at 7? His daughter's got Family Day at school tomorrow. He mentioned she's not looking forward to it. Worried about not having a mother present, if you know what I mean." Victoria had known what she meant. She'd spent the entire evening in her apartment, sitting on the floor, trying to figure out what kind of woman shows up at a school event uninvited, involving herself in the life of a child she didn't know, trying to solve a problem that wasn't hers to solve. But she knew the answer to that question. The answer was the kind of woman who'd spent the past 7 weeks learning what it felt like to be invisible in her own life, the kind of woman whose ex-husband had just been calling repeatedly, trying to drag her back into negotiations about money and property, about custody arrangements that had already been decided. The kind of woman who'd just realized, at 42 years old, that she had the power to choose who she wanted to be, and she wanted to be someone who showed up for people, even when it was complicated, even when it wasn't her responsibility to do so, even when it scared her. So she'd bought the navy blazer and the silk scarf. She'd done her hair carefully. She'd put on jewelry that communicated something about resources, about intention, about presence. She dressed like a woman who belonged somewhere, regardless of whether she did. And now, standing at the back of the multi-purpose room of Riverside Elementary, watching a little girl's face crumple in front of her entire classroom, because someone had asked where her mother was, Victoria understood that she'd made the only decision she could have made. She walked through the room without acknowledging anyone. Not Mrs. Patterson, not the other parents, not the children staring at her with the specific curiosity that children have. When a stranger enters their space, she walked with the clarity of someone who knew exactly where she needed to be, who didn't need permission for her presence, who carried authority in the particular way of women who'd learned to refuse diminishment. She walked directly to DeShawn and Amara. She took DeShawn's hand, not as a greeting, not as a symbolic gesture. She simply held his hand, her fingers lacing through his, her touch communicating something that didn't require words. She was claiming them. She was claiming a place beside them. She was making it public and undeniable, impossible to ignore. "I'm sorry I'm late," she said softly, speaking only to him. "I'm Victoria." The room shifted. DeShawn's hand went absolutely still in hers. She could feel his pulse, accelerated, surprised, the physical manifestation of someone being confronted with a moment they hadn't prepared for. Amara was staring at Victoria with the specific intensity of a child, trying to understand something that didn't make sense. Her small hands were still holding her family card, her body still folded in on itself from the injury of the previous moment, but something had changed in her expression. Not trust yet, not understanding, but something like, whatever is happening right now, whatever this woman is doing, it wasn't random, it was chosen, it means something. Victoria knelt slowly, so she was closer to Amara's eye level. She moved with intention, with the kind of deliberate care that communicated, "I'm not here by accident, I'm not performing. I'm here because you matter." "Hi, sweetheart," Victoria said to Amara. "I'm Victoria, you must be the Amara I've heard so much about." Amara didn't respond, but she stopped crying. Mrs. Patterson's face had gone through several expressions: confusion, understanding, a kind of recalibration that Victoria could almost see happening. The other parents had adjusted their body language, some of them leaning slightly forward, their phones still at subtle angles. The children were silent, which meant they understood that something important was happening, even if they couldn't articulate what. DeShawn was frozen beside Victoria, his hand still in hers, his entire body communicating a state of shock mixed with something else, something that looked like recognition. Victoria stood up slowly, keeping her hand in his. She looked directly at Mrs. Patterson. "Thank you for saving us a seat," she said, as if she'd been invited, as if her presence was the most natural thing in the world. Mrs. Patterson nodded, seemed to accept this explanation, seemed to understand that Victoria had moved through some kind of boundary and claimed the other side. "Of course," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice slightly uncertain. "Would you all like to sit in the second row?" Victoria guided DeShawn and Amara toward the indicated seats, still holding his hand, making it impossible for anyone in the room to misunderstand what was being communicated. Family Day continued through the morning, with the particular momentum of institutional events, each activity following the previous one, each moment scheduled and prepared for, each transition announced by Mrs. Patterson with increasing confidence that the day was proceeding according to plan. But the plan had changed. Victoria had changed it by existing in the room, by standing beside DeShawn and Amara, by making her presence undeniable, and her intention unclear. Was she family? A family friend? Someone new in DeShawn's life? No one seemed sure, which meant that everyone was trying to figure it out, which meant that Amara's status had shifted. From single-parent child to child with a mysterious woman of clear resources attending her event. It was a small reframing, but reframings could matter. By the time the children had finished their craft projects and were moving toward the refreshment table, DeShawn had separated from Amara, positioning himself near Victoria, with the body language of someone trying to figure out how close to stand to her without it being significant. Victoria pretended not to notice. She helped with the cleanup of the craft stations, moving easily among the other parents, offering to carry things, asking about their children's projects, engaging in the small talk of people who were performing family participation for each other. She was aware of being looked at. Some of the looks were curious. Some of them were confused. Several were frankly assessing, women doing the math of her clothing and jewelry, trying to figure out what her position was in relation to DeShawn, when the room was calmer, when Amara was occupied with other children. Victoria and DeShawn found themselves near the refreshment table together. "How do you know Amara's name?" he asked quietly enough that no one else would hear, but with the directness of someone who needed answers. Victoria met his eyes. "I know her father, and I care about what happens to her." It wasn't a complete answer, but it was honest. DeShawn was quiet for a moment. He looked at her more carefully, really looked at her, as if trying to match the woman in front of him, with some version of a woman he'd known before. "I don't remember you from the cafe," he said slowly. "Or maybe I do. Maybe you were—" "Behind the counter," Victoria finished. "Yeah, I've been there for 7 years. You come in most mornings." Recognition crashed over him. She could see it in his face. The moment when the pieces rearranged themselves, when the woman in front of him stopped being a stranger and became someone he'd actually been in proximity to for years, without fully noticing her, which was its own kind of painful truth. How invisible could you be in a space where you worked? In proximity to people you saw regularly, doing work that kept the space running? "You're different," DeShawn said. And it wasn't a compliment or a criticism. It was an observation. Different from 7 years ago. Different from 12 years ago, when they'd known each other, in a version of their lives that had been interrupted by circumstance, by choice, by the general trajectory of time. "So are you," Victoria said softly. There was a moment of something passing between them, an acknowledgement of the people they'd been, and the people they'd become, the different weights they were now carrying. Then DeShawn pulled back. Not physically, but emotionally. Victoria watched his face close slightly, watched him retreat into the position of someone protecting something. "Thank you for coming," he said, and his tone was formal. "But this is complicated?" "Aren't the best things always?" Victoria responded, and she meant it to be light, but it landed heavier. He didn't respond to that. Instead, he excused himself to check on Amara, leaving Victoria standing alone near the refreshment table, trying to manage the feeling of having overstepped something that she hadn't explicitly been told not to cross. But he'd held her hand. He'd let her into his space. He'd come back here, which meant that whatever was happening was something he was choosing to allow, even if he was also choosing to be cautious about it. Amara had noticed the interaction. Children see what adults try to hide. She'd been watching her father and Victoria from across the room, reading the tension between them, understanding that something was being negotiated that couldn't be talked about directly. Later, when Victoria was helping Amara wash her hands in the bathroom, the girl asked point blank, "Are you my dad's girlfriend?" There was no good answer to that question. Victoria could lie, could say something non-committal, could defer the question, or she could be honest. She chose honesty. "I'm someone who cares about both of you," Victoria said carefully. "Is that okay?" Amara dried her hands on a paper towel, taking her time with the answer, as if considering something important. "Will you leave like my mom did?" she finally asked. It was the question underneath all the other questions. It was the wound that ran through every interaction, every moment of hesitation, every instance where Amara was trying to figure out whether to trust that the people in her life would stay. Victoria could have promised that she wouldn't leave. She could have given the kind of absolute reassurance that a child wanted to hear. Instead, she told the truth. "I don't know the future," she said, "but I know I'm not here by accident. And I know I'm not here because I need a place to hide. I'm here because you matter." Amara looked at her for a long moment, then she nodded slowly, as if accepting the answer. Not because it was what she wanted to hear, but because it was the most honest thing an adult could say. By mid-morning, Mrs. Patterson had begun to make assumptions. She approached DeShawn while he was standing alone, watching Amara and Victoria work together on a painting project. "Is that Riley's mother?" Mrs. Patterson asked, and the question itself revealed the assumptions she'd made. DeShawn's jaw tightened. "A friend, that's all." But even as he said it, he was watching Victoria laugh at something Amara had whispered to her, watching his daughter lean slightly into her shoulder. In a way that communicated comfort and trust, he was lying. And Mrs. Patterson probably knew it, and more importantly, he knew it. Amara was different when Victoria was present. It wasn't just that she was happier, it was that she seemed less defended. Her posture was lighter. Her voice carried more confidence. The particular tension that she usually carried. The tension of trying to make herself fit into a shape that wasn't built for her. Seemed to ease slightly. That terrified DeShawn. He'd spent 7 years learning to be enough for his daughter. He'd taught himself her needs, learned her particular language of fear and hope, structured his entire life around protecting her. From the knowledge that she was missing something, he'd managed their story, as a story of two people who were complete as they were, and now in the presence of a woman he hadn't seen in 12 years, in the presence of someone whose own status and resources and presence communicated something about what completeness looked like. He was watching his daughter understand what had been missing. Other teachers began making comments. "It's so nice when there's a female role model present," one of them said to him, as if Victoria's presence was a service being provided, as if the gap she was filling was something that DeShawn should be grateful for her attention to. "Children really benefit from having both perspectives," another adult offered, in the kind of tone that communicated concern wrapped in judgment. "It's wonderful for Amara to see a strong woman engaged in her education," Mrs. Patterson said, and the language itself, the way she'd begun to integrate Victoria into the narrative of Amara's schooling, as if Victoria had been invited here to provide something that DeShawn lacked, made DeShawn's skin prickling with something between gratitude and resentment. He wanted Amara to have positive influences, but he also wanted to be enough. He wanted the shape of their family to be sufficient, and he was suddenly, painfully aware that what he wanted might not be what was actually true about the world his daughter inhabited. Around 2:15 p.m., his phone buzzed. The text came from an unknown number. "Tell my wife I'm handling the settlement. Tell her to call me. This isn't finished." DeShawn's stomach dropped. He recognized the reference, even without the name attached. He forwarded it to Victoria anonymously. "Everything okay?" She didn't respond for 20 minutes. When she did, her message was brief. "I'll handle it." 3 words that communicated everything. 3 words that told DeShawn that whatever was happening, whatever the woman who'd shown up at his daughter's school event was dealing with, in her own life, it was complicated and ongoing and potentially dangerous. He moved closer to where Victoria and Amara were, without announcing it, without explaining the shift. His presence shifted from protective father to protective person, and Victoria noticed it. He could see the moment she recognized what was happening, the moment she understood that by involving herself in his life, she'd made him involve himself in hers. The understanding passed between them without words being necessary. The rest of Family Day proceeded with the particular tension of an event, where something underneath the surface has shifted. But the institutional machinery keeps moving forward anyway. Children continued their activities. Parents continued their conversations. Mrs. Patterson continued facilitating the morning schedule. But the energy had changed. Victoria stayed until the very end, helping to clean up craft stations, organizing supplies, moving with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in institutional spaces. Other parents watched her. Some of them seemed to recognize something about her, the markers of education, of resources, of a particular kind of social standing. One of them, a woman named Patricia, actually asked, "What do you do, if you don't mind my asking?" Victoria answered smoothly, "Commercial real estate development." "Nothing interesting?" "Mostly property management and acquisition." The woman nodded as if this explained something, as if understanding Victoria's professional standing clarified her purpose and presence. As the event was winding down, as parents began gathering their children and making their way toward the parking lot, Victoria's phone began to buzz. Call notifications from a number registered in her phone as H. She silenced it. Then another call came through and another. When she finally checked the messages, there were 3 texts waiting. "You're making a mistake. We're not done. Your lawyer is stalling. I'm not going to let you lock me out. Tell her to stop the settlement conversation, or I'm coming to find you and we can discuss this in person." Victoria's entire body went rigid. DeShawn saw it happen. He watched her face shift from present to somewhere else, watched her shoulders tighten, watched her slide the phone back into her pocket, with the kind of controlled motion that communicated she was managing something actively. He touched her arm lightly. "You okay?" She turned to him, and for a moment her composure fractured just slightly, enough for him to see the fear underneath it, the weight of something that was actively pursuing her. "It's fine," she said, which was clearly not true. "Everything's handled." But they both knew it wasn't as they walked toward the parking lot, as other families dispersed into their cars and their lives. Victoria apologized. "I'm sorry for the complications I brought into this," she said quietly. DeShawn didn't accept the apology. "Don't be sorry you showed up for my daughter. Be honest about what's coming." Victoria nodded, understanding that she'd already crossed some kind of line, understanding that by choosing to involve herself in DeShawn's life, she'd made him complicit in her own struggles. "There are some things I'm dealing with," she admitted, "things that might not be finished." "What kind of things?" DeShawn asked. And the edge in his voice surprised both of them. He was speaking like someone who'd already decided that he would protect her, who'd already made that choice without being fully aware he was making it. "An ex-husband who doesn't understand that the divorce is final," Victoria said. "Someone who believes that he still has leverage, in situations where leverage no longer exists." DeShawn's expression shifted. "Is he dangerous?" "He's controlling," Victoria said, "which to him is the same as powerful. But I don't think he'll hurt anyone physically. He'll just try to take things that matter." In the parking lot under the yellow wash of the security lights, they stood together, DeShawn and Amara and Victoria, understanding that something had shifted, understanding that choices were being made that would have consequences, understanding that the morning's simple intervention had set off a series of events that couldn't be undone. 3 days passed after Family Day. 3 days in which DeShawn and Victoria didn't communicate. Beyond the text messages he sent to check on whether things were okay, and she answered with the kinds of responses that suggested she was managing something difficult in silence. On the 4th day, Victoria texted him, "Can I see you?" The question was simple. The implications were complex. DeShawn arranged for his neighbor to watch Amara after school. He told her it was a work-related meeting, which was technically not true, but also not entirely false. This was about work, about the work of figuring out who Victoria was, what she represented, what it meant that she'd walked into his life, at exactly the moment when both he and his daughter had stopped believing in possibilities. They met at a coffee shop that wasn't June's cafe, neutral territory, somewhere they couldn't be observed by people who knew DeShawn's story, or Victoria's present situation. Victoria was already there when he arrived, sitting at a corner table, both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that she hadn't touched. "Thank you for coming," she said when he sat down. "You said you wanted to see me," DeShawn replied. "So I'm here." Victoria took a long breath. "I need to be honest about some things." "Okay," DeShawn said, and he steeled himself for whatever was coming next. "I shouldn't have shown up at your daughter's school without asking you first," Victoria began. "I knew that coming would complicate everything. I did it anyway because I was selfish. I was selfish because seeing you reminded me of something I thought I'd lost, and I wanted to prove to myself and to you that I wasn't the person who disappears when things get difficult." DeShawn listened without interrupting. 12 years ago we knew each other," Victoria continued, "and life happened, and we became different people living different lives. But when I saw you at the cafe, something I'd buried a long time ago just woke up. I wanted to be the kind of person who shows up for people, instead of running away from them. And your daughter seemed like a place to start proving that to myself." "Is that why you came?" DeShawn asked carefully. "To prove something to yourself?" "It started that way," Victoria said, "but it changed. By the time I walked into that room, by the time I saw your daughter's face, it wasn't about proving anything to myself anymore. It was about showing up for her, and for you." DeShawn felt something in his chest shift, a wall he'd built and maintained for years, a wall constructed to keep out the possibility of wanting things that couldn't be safely wanted. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "Because Amara's already looking at you like you're a possibility, and I can't let her hope for something that isn't real." Victoria met his eyes directly. "I'm terrified," she said, "but I'm sure. I'm sure because I've spent 42 years making myself smaller for other people's comfort. I'm sure because these past few weeks are the first time in a long time that I've felt like I was actually choosing my own life. And I want you and Amara to be part of that choice. And if it gets harder, DeShawn asked. With your ex-husband. With whatever's coming. Then I'll still be here, Victoria said, or I'll leave honestly and tell you both why. But I won't disappear. I'm done disappearing. DeShawn reached across the table and took her hand. Not romantically yet, but with intention, with commitment. They sat in silence for a long moment, hands connected, understanding that they'd just made a choice that was going to reshape both of their lives. Amara asks about you every day, DeShawn finally said, whether you're coming back. I'm coming back, Victoria said simply, not because I have to, because I want to. The days that followed were strange. Strange in the way that periods of calm before crisis are strange. Victoria and DeShawn began actually spending time together. Real time. Not just the accidental proximity of the school event. Amara began to relax slightly. Began to understand that Victoria was someone who returned. Someone who kept promises. Someone who existed in her life on a regular basis. But underneath the surface, Victoria's phone kept buzzing. Phone calls came through at odd times. Text messages arrived in rapid succession. The pattern was familiar enough that DeShawn could read what was happening. Without Victoria having to explain it, her ex-husband was escalating. He was running out of tools to control her, and that scarcity was making him more aggressive. One evening, while Victoria was helping Amara with homework, her phone rang. She silenced it. Then it rang again and again. When she finally checked the messages, there were 5 missed calls and 7 texts waiting. He's in town, Victoria said quietly. I think he's trying to intimidate me into reopening settlement conversations. DeShawn felt something in him go cold. Is he dangerous? He's predictable, Victoria said, which, in its own way, is a form of danger. But I've also learned that I'm stronger than I thought I was. The week before the Spring Art Showcase, Victoria finally called her lawyer to finalize the divorce settlement completely. She'd been stalling, hoping that Harrison would just accept the terms and move on. But it was becoming clear that he wasn't going to accept anything voluntarily. So she signed the papers. She agreed to terms that gave him slightly more than she'd initially wanted, just to be done. And she told her lawyer, make sure he knows that this is final. There's no negotiation after this. There's no leverage left. She'd given up some property to buy her peace. It seemed like a worthwhile exchange. One evening, about a week before the Spring Art Showcase, Amara asked DeShawn a question that he'd been dreading and expecting in equal measure. Is Victoria going to be my mom? They were making dinner together. Something they did most nights. Something that had become a ritual of their time together. Amara was chopping vegetables with the precision of a child who'd been given responsibility and taken it seriously. DeShawn paused before answering. This was a question that required honesty, but it also required care. No, he said finally, Victoria is not going to be your mother. Your mother is your mother. That's a role that belongs only to her, even though she made the choice not to be in your life. Then what is Victoria? Amara asked. I don't know yet, DeShawn said, but I know she cares about you. I know she shows up. I know she's becoming important to both of us. Amara considered this. Is she your girlfriend? Maybe, DeShawn said. Ask me again in a few months. But what he meant was, she could be. If she stays, if we're both brave enough to let her. The Spring Art Showcase was scheduled for 3:30 p.m. on a Thursday in May, in the same multipurpose room where Family Day had happened 6 weeks earlier. The room had been transformed. Student paintings covered every wall. Paper lanterns in soft colors hung from the ceiling. Parents moved through the space with punch cups and cookie plates, chatting in clusters, admiring their children's work. DeShawn had arrived with Amara right at 3:30. They'd spent a few minutes looking at her artwork. Watercolor paintings, clay sculptures, self-portraits created with careful attention and growing confidence. Victoria had said she'd meet them there. She arrived at 3:42, moving through the room with the familiar presence of someone who'd learned to claim space without asking permission. They stood together, the 3 of them, looking at Amara's display. There was a painting of trees under a blue sky, self-portraits with increasingly careful attention to detail. A clay bird with wings that didn't quite match, and in the center of the display a new drawing, clearly more recent than the others. It showed a house under a deep blue sky. 3 figures stood in front of it, holding hands. One figure in the center was taller than the other 2, clearly meant to be an adult. The other 2 figures were smaller, clearly meant to be children. Except there were 3 figures, not 2. Is that us? Amara asked, watching Victoria's face. It looks like you and your dad, Victoria said carefully. There's 3 people, Amara said. I drew the 3 of us. DeShawn looked at the drawing, at Amara's attempt to reimagine her family structure, to put into visual form the possibility of something that hadn't existed before Victoria arrived. Several other parents had noticed the drawing. They were pointing it out to their own children. They were asking questions, making observations, creating small narratives around what it might mean. That a child had drawn a house with 3 figures, and then at 3:47 p.m., The back door opened. Harrison Sutherland walked in. He was exactly the kind of man Victoria's appearance suggested would exist in her background story. Expensive suit, expensive watch. The kind of physical confidence that came from a lifetime of understanding that spaces had been designed for people like him. He moved through the room with the assumption of belonging, scanning the crowd like someone looking for something he believed was rightfully his. He found Victoria almost immediately. He walked directly toward her, past Amara, past DeShawn, moving with the singular focus of someone operating from a script that had worked for him before. "We need to talk," he said, not a greeting, not a hello to his ex-wife, just a demand, loud enough for nearby parents to hear. Amara went absolutely rigid beside Victoria. Children understand more than adults give them credit for. Amara understood from the tone and the demand and the body language that someone was about to try to take something that she cared about. Victoria's entire demeanor changed. "Amara, honey," Victoria said quietly, "why don't you help Mrs. Patterson with the punch bowl for a minute?" Amara's eyes widened. "No, I don't want to." She was smart enough to understand that Victoria was sending her away, because something difficult was about to happen. She was old enough to realize that adults sometimes create distance to protect children from things they don't want to see, and she was unwilling to be protected this time. DeShawn placed a hand on her shoulder. "Go on, baby. We'll be right here." Amara moved reluctantly, but she moved. The moment she was gone, Victoria's expression shifted. It hardened into something that was not angry, but was decidedly determined. "You can't be here," she said to Harrison. Her voice was level. "You can't do this." "Claire," Harrison began. And Victoria flinched at the name. He was using the old name, the name she'd been before, the name that belonged to the version of herself that had been willing to make herself smaller. "My name is Victoria," she corrected, "and you need to leave." "We need to finalize some settlement discussions," Harrison said, as if Victoria's clear refusal to engage was a negotiation tactic, rather than a boundary. "Your lawyer is being unreasonable about the property division." "My lawyer is being exactly as reasonable as the divorce settlement I already signed," Victoria said. The room had gone quiet. Other parents were pretending not to listen, but they were listening. "You received papers last week?" "The divorce is final." "All negotiations are concluded." Harrison's face reddened. "We're not finished," he said, his voice dropping but his presence becoming more threatening. "I'm not going to let you lock me out of—" "You're not locked out of anything," Victoria said, and her voice was ice. "But you are leaving this school. You are leaving this room, and you are not contacting me again except through my lawyer." "That's not your decision to make," Harrison said. And something in the way he said it, the assumption that he still had authority over situations involving Victoria, seemed to ignite something in the people who were watching. Several parents had stopped their conversations. Several sets of eyes were now openly on Victoria and Harrison. "Yes," Victoria said quietly, "it is. I'm done making my life smaller to keep you comfortable. I'm done negotiating with someone who refuses to accept that our marriage is over. And I'm done letting you believe that you have any power in my life." She took a step back, putting literal distance between them. "Leave," she said, "right now, or I'm calling the police and reporting you for harassment and threatening behavior at a school event." For a moment, Harrison didn't move. Then, understanding that he'd lost the audience, that the narrative had shifted, that the woman in front of him was no longer operating from the framework of accommodation, he turned and walked toward the exit. But the damage was done. Not to Victoria, the damage was to the room's understanding of who held power in this situation. The damage was to the message that had been communicated, silently but undeniably, that Victoria was someone who would not be controlled, who would not shrink, who would not accept being made smaller. She'd won the moment, and everyone in the room knew it. Amara ran back to Victoria before Harrison had even fully left the building. "Did he try to make you leave?" Amara asked, her face pale. "No, sweetheart," Victoria said, kneeling down to be eye level with her. "I made him leave." In the parking lot under the yellow wash of the security lights, Victoria finally allowed the shaking to begin. "I'm so sorry Amara had to see that," she said, her voice trembling. DeShawn stepped closer. Didn't touch her yet, just made his presence known. "You're not sorry you stood up for yourself. You're sorry he was here. Those are different things." Victoria looked at him and her eyes were wet. "I was terrified." "I know," DeShawn said. "That's what made it brave." He reached for her hand and held it. Amara was watching them, understanding something about what had just happened, understanding that the woman she'd watched draw on a piece of paper, the woman she'd been afraid to trust, the woman who'd shown up at family day, that woman was strong enough to say no, and mean it. On the drive home, Amara stared out the window, processing the events of the afternoon. "Is he going to make her leave?" she finally asked. DeShawn gripped the wheel. "I don't know yet, but I know she's strong enough to make her own choice about that. And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure she chooses to stay." He meant it with an intensity that surprised even himself. Alone in his kitchen later that night, after Amara had been put to bed, after the house had gone quiet, DeShawn admitted what he'd been avoiding for weeks. He was in love with Victoria. Not the version of her from 12 years ago, the version of her who walked into uncomfortable situations, who refused to be diminished, who was actively choosing to do the work of becoming someone safe. That was the version he was falling for. Victoria met with her divorce lawyer 4 times over the next week. Patricia, her lawyer, was a black woman in her 60s who'd seen enough divorces to recognize every pattern of control and resistance that men like Harrison could employ. He's going to escalate, Patricia warned during their 3rd meeting. Now that you've stood up to him publicly, now that you've made it clear you're not negotiating, he's probably going to try some kind of final leverage play. What can he do? Victoria asked. The divorce is finalized. The settlement is signed. Probably nothing legal, Patricia said, but he might try anyway. Men like him don't accept loss well. Victoria spent her evenings doing paperwork, finalizing the property division, reviewing financial statements, making sure that every detail of her exit from the marriage was documented and undeniable. Each signature felt like a small act of freedom. Each one also felt like the closing of a door. She was officially severing ties with the life she'd been living. She was officially becoming someone entirely new. During this time, she didn't contact DeShawn. She knew he was protecting his daughter, giving Amara space and stability, while Victoria's own situation remained unstable. She knew that her silence was being interpreted as possible abandonment. She texted him once, "I'm handling something important. Please tell Amara I'm thinking of her." He responded hours later, "She asks about you every day." Victoria understood the message underneath his words. He was telling her that hope had been planted, that his daughter was now vulnerable, in ways that depended on Victoria following through, that if Victoria disappeared, the wound would be deeper than if she'd never shown up at all. So she worked harder. She signed the papers faster. She pushed through the legal process with intensity, understanding that the sooner this was complete, the sooner she could show DeShawn and Amara that she'd done the hard work, that she'd finished what she started, that she could be trusted to stay. On the 9th day after Harrison's appearance at the school, Victoria's lawyer called with news. "It's done," Patricia said. "All finalized, all signed. You're officially divorced. And your ex-husband has been advised that any further contact regarding financial or property matters will result in legal action for harassment." Victoria hung up the phone and sat alone in her apartment, understanding that the last thread connecting her to her old life had been severed. She was free, and more importantly, she was available, not as an escape or a refuge, but as a choice. She could choose to be in DeShawn's life now, not because she was running from something, but because she was running towards something, running toward the possibility of being part of a family, running toward the possibility of mattering to people who mattered to her. DeShawn opened the door to find Victoria on his porch on the evening of the 9th day. She was wearing a black coat, her hair pulled back, a manila envelope tucked under one arm. She looked exhausted but different, not fragile, but decided. "Can we talk?" she asked. He stepped outside, pulled the door almost closed behind him, protecting Amara from hope that might disappear. Victoria held out the envelope. "Final property release," she said. "Final financial settlement." "Everything is signed and completed as of yesterday." DeShawn took the envelope. It was heavier than it looked, heavy with what it meant. Not just a divorce finalized, but a woman who'd done the hard work, who'd followed through, who'd made a choice to build a life on her own terms. The paperwork was delayed because Harrison was stalling, Victoria explained. He thought he still had leverage. He didn't realize that leverage only works when someone is willing to be leveraged. "I wasn't willing anymore." DeShawn opened the envelope slowly. The documents were real. Dates, signatures, the official end of a legal marriage. "That should matter to me how?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Because I promised you I would finish this," Victoria said. "Because I meant it. Because I'm not asking you to pretend none of this happened. I'm asking if I can come inside." Before DeShawn could answer, the front door opened. Amara stood there in sock feet, one hand on the frame, her eyes moving from Victoria to the envelope to her father. "Are you leaving?" she asked, and the question carried all the weight of her fears, all the accumulated trauma of being the child of a single parent, all the anxiety of having begun to hope, and then being forced to wait. Victoria crouched so they were eye level. "No," she said, "not because of him. And not because things got hard. I'm here because I mean it." That moment, where Victoria made her choice visible to a child, shifted something fundamental. DeShawn stepped aside. "Come in." Amara exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for days. They sat in the living room together, the 3 of them. Amara was sitting on the couch between Victoria and DeShawn, holding a throw pillow, working up the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her since Harrison appeared at the school. "If you stay," Amara asked, her voice very small, "are you going to disappear again?" Victoria didn't rush to answer. She didn't promise perfection. She didn't make the mistake of assuring a child that the world would be simple or pain-free. "I can't promise life will never get messy," Victoria said carefully. "But I can promise that I'm not here by accident. I'm here because I care about you. I'm here because I care about your dad. And I'm here because some people don't come into your life just to fill a moment. They come because they mean to stay and do the work." Amara studied her for what felt like a long time. Then she reached forward and wrapped her arms around Victoria's neck. Victoria closed her eyes and held on. DeShawn looked away for 1 second, because the sight hurt in the best possible way. The moment when his daughter felt secure enough to trust someone, to reach for someone, to believe that someone might stay. 1 week later, Riverside Elementary held its spring art display, a second exhibition of student work, in the same multi-purpose room where Family Day had happened and where Harrison had attempted to reclaim authority. This time, when DeShawn and Amara arrived, Victoria was already there, waiting for them in the parking lot. DeShawn held her hand as they walked into the building together. The room was decorated similarly to the earlier event. Student paintings on the walls, decorations hanging from the ceiling, parents moving through the space with cups of punch and pride on their faces. But something had changed internally. DeShawn was done arranging his life, according to what strangers thought a family should resemble. He walked in with Victoria on his one side, and Amara on his other. And if people stared, if people whispered, if people tried to figure out what his family structure meant, and how it challenged their understanding of how families could be shaped, he didn't care. Amara led them to a display board. There were the same watercolor paintings, the same self-portraits, the same clay bird with mismatched wings. That represented her growing understanding of imperfection as acceptable. And in the center, a new drawing. It showed a house under a deep blue sky. 3 figures stood in front of it, holding hands. The figures were drawn with careful attention to detail. Specific clothing, specific poses, specific expressions. They were clearly meant to be a family. One of Amara's classmates approached them. "Who's that?" the girl asked, pointing to the woman in the drawing. Amara looked up at DeShawn, then at Victoria. Neither of them answered for her. She was old enough to speak for herself. She was old enough to claim her own narrative. Amara lifted her chin. "That's my family," she said simply. The girl accepted it with the ease that children are capable of when adults don't teach them otherwise. "Cool," she said, and wandered off toward the cookies. Later, Victoria looked at the drawing with genuine attention. "I like the shoes," she said, pointing to the figure's feet. Amara grinned. "They're still dramatic." "They should be," Victoria said. Amara reached for Victoria's hand. Victoria took it. DeShawn took Victoria's other hand without having to think himself into courage. They stood there together in the bright school lights, while laughter drifted around them, while spring pressed gently at the windows, while 3 people who'd found each other, despite odds and circumstance and pain, simply existed in the space of being a family. The confrontation between Victoria and Harrison at the Spring Art Showcase became a kind of turning point, not just for Victoria, but for the entire school community's understanding of what families could look like. Mrs. Patterson, prompted by the school principal's own reflection on the morning's events, began quietly working on changing the Family Day format for the following year. Instead of mums and dads, the event would focus on people who love us. Instead of emphasizing traditional 2-parent households, the event would acknowledge and celebrate the many configurations that families could take. Harrison Sutherland's lawyer reached out to Victoria's lawyer with a simple message. "My client understands that further contact regarding the divorce settlement would be inadvisable. He's willing to move forward without further negotiation." What that meant, translated into plain language, was that Harrison had accepted defeat. Victoria's public stand, her visible strength, her refusal to be controlled or diminished, had changed the calculus entirely. He no longer believed he had leverage. He'd moved on to other things, other people to control, other situations where his particular kind of power might still work. Amara's confidence transformed visibly. In the weeks that followed, she stopped apologizing for her family structure. She stopped making herself smaller in classrooms. She began inviting classmates to her house to meet her family, phrasing that centered Victoria, DeShawn, and herself as a unit rather than a deficit. By the time school ended for the year, Amara had been invited to 3 birthday parties, had made plans for summer activities with friends, and had stopped asking whether Victoria was going to leave. Victoria moved into DeShawn's house gradually, not as a romantic gesture, but as a practical decision made over several conversations. They talked about what it meant. They talked about how Amara would understand it. They talked about what they wanted their family to look like, and whether moving in together was moving toward that vision, or moving away from it. The decision was made over tea one evening, when Victoria was already spending 4 nights a week at the house, when her apartment was becoming more empty than full, when it started to make sense to consolidate their lives. "I want to do this right," DeShawn said. "I want Amara to understand this is a choice we're making together, not something happening to her." They sat Amara down and asked her, "If Victoria moved in here, if she became part of our household, How would you feel about that? Amara considered it seriously. Would she be here all the time? Yes, Victoria said, if you want that. Even when things get hard? Amara asked, testing the commitment. Even when things get hard, Victoria promised. Amara nodded. Then I want her to stay. The three of them existed in a version of family. That didn't look like the pictures on the original Family Day bulletin board, and they'd finally, completely, made peace with that. DeShawn had learned through watching Victoria that love wasn't measured only by what pain you could prevent. It was also measured by who returned, who told the truth, who did the hard work to become safe, who chose over and over not to let fear make every decision. Victoria had learned through knowing DeShawn that safety didn't come from controlling outcomes or managing other people's behavior. It came from choosing vulnerability, from admitting fear, from standing in your own power, even when it would be easier to shrink. Amara had learned something that most 8-year-olds don't have to learn. That families aren't predetermined by society's expectations. They're built, chosen, and rebuilt when necessary. That the shape of a family matters less than the intention behind it. The three of them didn't need external validation anymore. They'd already validated each other. Through consistent choice, through honest conversation, through the simple act of showing up, even when it was hard. DeShawn would sometimes stand in their kitchen in the early morning, before work, before school, before the day's demands, and watch Victoria make coffee while Amara colored at the table. He'd think about all the ways this version of his life was different from the version he'd been living a year ago. A year ago, he'd been protecting his daughter from hope. He'd been managing his own loneliness. By telling himself that his family was complete as it was, he'd been working night shifts and coming home to an apartment that was clean and organized and utterly empty of possibility. Now he was coming home to people, real people, imperfect people, people who'd chosen to be in his life, despite cost and risk, and the very real possibility that everything could fall apart. Victoria sometimes stood in the shower and cried, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being free. She thought about the woman she'd been before, the woman who'd made herself smaller and smaller, who'd negotiated away her own needs, who'd believed that her value lay in her ability to accommodate other people's requirements. That woman was gone, and the woman who'd replaced her, the woman who could say no and mean it, who could walk away from situations that didn't serve her, who could build a life on her own terms, was someone she actually wanted to be. Amara drew pictures that were increasingly complex and honest. She drew her family in different configurations, depending on her mood. Sometimes Victoria was holding her hand, while DeShawn looked on. Sometimes the three of them were standing under an umbrella during a rainstorm. Sometimes they were sitting around a table, eating a meal that Victoria had cooked, laughing at something that wasn't funny, except that it was funny because they were together. The pictures showed what Amara understood about her family. It was resilient, it was chosen, it was unconventional, it was real. DeShawn had spent 9 years believing that being a good father meant protecting his daughter from loss and complication. But standing in his kitchen one morning, with Victoria making breakfast and Amara still half asleep at the table, he understood something deeper, something that shifted his entire understanding of what protection actually meant. The protection he'd offered was real but incomplete. It wasn't until someone else chose to stay, actually chose, despite cost and risk and vulnerability, that his daughter learned the most important lesson a child can learn. That love isn't a story written for you by circumstance or bad luck or the shape of your family. It's a story you write together with people brave enough to show up. Victoria had moved through the world her whole life believing that power meant control. Control of situations, control of people, control of outcomes. Harrison had taught her that control was fragile, that approval was temporary, that no amount of managing other people's comfort could create genuine safety. But DeShawn showed her something different. That power also meant the ability to choose vulnerability, to admit fear, to stand in your own truth even when it would be easier to shrink. That was the kind of power she'd been searching for her entire adult life, and she finally found it in a kitchen in a working-class neighborhood, standing beside a man who'd never tried to make her smaller. Sometimes a family doesn't begin with perfection or traditional structure. Sometimes it begins the moment someone, exhausted, scared, but committed, decides that staying is harder than leaving, and chooses to stay anyway. DeShawn, Victoria, and Amara weren't a fantasy family. They were something better. They were real, chosen, and unshakable. They were proof that families could be built by people willing to do the work. They were proof that love could look like reaching out, when everything in you wanted to pull back. They were proof that sometimes the most powerful act in the world is the simple choice to show up, again and again, for people who matter.